Hello everyone, this is Ultrahang. My name is Jonathan Nagy-Bato. Our guest today is Dr. John Laughland, the director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome in Hungary and welcome in this show.
Thank you for inviting me.
So to start with, you were born in England,
yes.
You teach in France,
yes.
And now you are working for a party in the Netherlands.
Correct.
How did you ended up in the Netherlands from England?
Well, I live in France. I don't. I of course go to the Netherlands very often now, but I ended up doing this job for Forum for Democracy International through my friendship with Thierry Baudet, whom I believe you've interviewed as well as me. And Thierry, as you and your listeners know, is a member of the Dutch Parliament, and he very kindly asked me to work for him and indeed to run the international side of his party. And of course, our job is to make the activities of the party known around the world, largely by translating things into English, because of course, obviously, debates and so on are obviously all in Dutch. In the Parliament, and also to make contacts around the world. That's of course the other aspect of the work, is to be friendly with other parties. In the case of Hungary, with Mihazang, and also of course to be a centre. We hope, perhaps not a centre, but anyway a place where conservative and anti-globalist ideas are developed.
If someone from Hungary look up your name or like search you in Google,
yeah.
The first thing that occurs is that you are a Russian agent, you're a Russian spy. Are you a Russian agent?
No. It's disinformation. It's a lie, but it's a lie that is very tenacious. It's a lie that's been told about me now for 15 or 16 years, because from 2008 to 2018 I worked for a think tank in Paris, which was financed from Russia and it was a French organization, but it was financed by Russia, and the president was Russian, so that was very much part of our identity. It wasn't financed by the Russian state, but it was financed from Russia. And even though that job finished, it's now 6 or 7 years ago, finished in 2017, at the end of 2017, this lie keeps being told. And there's a very simple reason why it keeps being told. Long after the time when I worked for it, I wasn't a Russian agent then, but it carries on being told, this lie, because it's simply a way to attack the people that I work for. So when I started to work for Forum for Democracy, the Dutch press recycled all this disinformation about me, these lies, in order to attack Thierry Baudet and Forum for Democracy. And then I spent 6 months in Hungary at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. And so it was a way to attack Fidesz, because obviously MCC is close to Fidesz. So it was that's why there are these articles about me in the Hungarian press. I've actually forgotten now. We did at one point demand an apology from one of the Hungarian media, and I've actually forgotten now, I'm afraid, what happened in the end. MCC's lawyers and I were in discussion. Maybe they decided that there wasn't anything that they could do about it. I've actually now, I'm sorry to say, forgotten what we did. But I know from experience that you can denounce this lie. You can write to the newspapers as much as you like. You can say that it's not true. I've said it's not true to as many people who want to listen, but it carries on being told, and I think it'll carry on being told probably until the day I die.
Before I check if everything is okay, because it's my first interview here, and I'm a bit nervous, but everything is okay. Sorry. You wrote a book called The Tainted Source, The Undemocratic Origins of the European Idea. In this book, you claim that the idea of of a united Europe has non-democratic elements. What is the book published in 1997. It was like more than 30 years ago. A lot has changed since then. What is the basic thesis of this book? And yeah, what is the basic thesis?
Well, there are 5 chapters, and each chapter deals with a different aspect. The first chapter is the one that most people know about, where I discuss the European idea as it was formulated in the 1940s, 30s and 40s by the Nazis and by fascists across Europe, fascists and other pro-Nazi movements. So, for example, there was a well-developed European propaganda in Nazi Germany. There was substantial pro-European propaganda in Vichy France. I don't know about Hungary, quite possibly in Hungary during the occupation. I'm not aware of the situation in Hungary. I don't read Hungarian. But in Italy, obviously, in Belgium, really all over Europe, all over occupied Europe, there was the idea that that the Nazis were forming a new Europe and so on. The reason why I wrote about that was to simply explain or argue that to be anti-European is not nationalist in the bad sense, because at that stage already people said if you're anti-Europe then you're a nationalist and you're a Nazi, and so I was explaining that actually the Nazis themselves had very developed European ideology. Then there's a chapter about geopolitics, about the way that Germany would benefit from United Europe, particularly from a single European currency. There's a chapter about currency and about the role of currency in government, particularly fiat currency. There's a rather philosophical chapter about law and the meaning of law and what law should be and what law shouldn't be. So there are various different aspects to this problem. But the claim that Europe is undemocratic is, yes, of course I discuss that in the book, but it's not just the idea that's undemocratic. What's much worse is the daily practice of the European Union, which is violently undemocratic, anti-democratic. We've seen, I think, 5 or 6 referenda have taken place in Europe over the last 30 years, which have been ignored or overturned in Ireland, in France, in the Netherlands. We've seen, so those are the most flagrant examples of anti-democratic behaviour. I'm referring to referenda where people voted against treaties. So, for example, the European Constitution in 2005, as I'm sure everybody knows, was repackaged and then passed as the Lisbon Treaty a few years later. But the daily functioning of the European Union is totally undemocratic because all power is concentrated in the European Council, which is a meeting of government ministers which votes laws by majority. And that constitutional structure, which gives legislative power to governments without any parliamentary control, because there's no control or very little control. There is no control of the Council by the Parliament, the European Parliament. Of course, the Parliament is involved in legislation, but there's no real parliamentary control over what the European Council does. And of course, there's no control either by national parliaments. National parliaments, by definition, cannot control their ministers in the European Council because it votes by majority. And even if parliaments were to give a mandate to their ministers to say what they can and cannot negotiate, which no parliament does. But even if they were to do that, it would be completely useless because the minister may well be in a minority. He may be outvoted by other countries. So the daily functioning is self-evidently undemocratic. And even pro-European federalists accept this. They've accepted it for years. They have an expression, the democratic deficit. In my view, the deficit can never be filled and will never be filled because the current functioning of the European Union suits national governments very well because it gives them the ability to vote through laws among themselves and out of view, really, of national electorates. So I'm afraid it's a sort of cartel. It's essentially a cartel of governments acting as cartels do against the interests of their clients, if I may use that analogy, who are, of course, the citizens.
I heard a theory that the European Union, or the frame of the European Union, was the idea of Adolf Hitler to save Germany's power after the Nazi era. Is this true, or it's like a conspiracy theory?
I don't think that's true. As I say, the Nazis did have strong pro-European propaganda, but I'm not aware of a specific Nazi plan for a post-war order. I don't believe actually that the Nazis did make such a plan, because obviously they expected to win, and in fact they didn't. So of course they did make a plan for occupied Europe, and indeed one of the documents that I discovered when I wrote the book is the minutes of a congress held in Berlin in 1942, I think, if I remember correctly, but certainly during the war, called in German Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft, which means European Economic Community. So it's pretty amazing that the Nazi economics minister organized this conference. So it clearly did exist. The idea existed. But I'm not claiming that there's a direct filiation between Nazi Germany and the post-war European communities.
Maybe the biggest difference is that the Nazis thought about a Europe which was led by the Germans,
yes,
and the European Union is led by?
Well, it has been, I would say, in the last 20 years, very much under German leadership. But behind the Germans is, of course, the Americans, because of all the European countries, Germany, I would say, is no doubt the most important American ally. Germany and Poland. The Americans are shifting, as it happens, in recent years.
But that's because Germany is still occupied, or Germany decided to be the ally?
It's partly because Germany is occupied. It's also because Germany is the most important, obviously, economy and power. It's the biggest country in Europe. And and of course, it's, as I explain in my geopolitical chapter, it is the central power, die Macht in der Mitte Europas, the power in the center of Europe. And that's why it is important for the Americans, because it provides them with as they say in German, a Stützpunkt, a base, if you like, in Europe. But as I say, as it happens, the Americans are shifting at the moment. In the last couple of years, they've shifted their alliance away from Germany and towards Poland. But that's a separate subject. Perhaps I don't know whether you want to talk about that as well. But for the entire post-war period, let's say up until about 2 years ago, Germany was the principal American ally. Of course, Britain as well, but on continental Europe, Germany.
The former UK Minister for Europe, Denis McShane, has described you as one of the intellectual architects of Brexit. What is your view about Brexit and today's English politics?
Well, I was, of course, very much in favor of Brexit. I belong to a generation where a lot of my friends were anti-European and in some cases devoted their careers to fighting the European Union. And of course, the battle was met with success in 2020 when Brexit was finally realized after many, many years of battle. What do I think of it? Well, I think it is, of course, the breakup of the European Union. It's the beginning of the end of the European Union.
Like the first country who left.
Well, I don't know whether others will leave. I'm not necessarily saying that they will, although it's not impossible. But objectively, the fact is that the European Union has lost its second biggest net contributor, because Britain was the biggest contributor after Germany to the budget. It's lost its financial capital, because London is the financial capital of Europe and indeed in some senses of the world. It's lost its primary military power, because the British, of course with the French, but the British army, the British armed forces are no doubt or at least they certainly think of themselves as the biggest and most powerful military power in Europe. Again, that may be changing in favor of Poland. But so the European Union, objectively, if you think of it from the point of view of the European Union, has objectively suffered a massive loss by losing Britain. As far as the effect on Britain is concerned, unfortunately, very little has been done in Britain to take advantage of Brexit. It was said during the referendum campaign that Britain would be able to deregulate and become an even freer economy and so on. None of that has happened. Britain is very closely aligned and remains very closely aligned with a sort of semi-socialist model which exists more or less everywhere in Europe. So there hasn't really been any noticeable effects in Britain itself as a result of Brexit. Trade with the European Union continues to be, in fact, I think it's higher actually than it was when Britain was in the European Union, oddly enough. So it hasn't suffered in that sense. Immigration continues at a very, very high rate into Britain. But otherwise, there isn't really any discernible consequence, either positive or negative, for the United Kingdom so far, as far as I can tell.
We can see that the mayor of London is like a Muslim Pakistani.
Yes.
The prime minister is a guy from India.
Yep.
The leader of the Scottish National Party is like has also a migration background.
He's Pakistani. Yeah.
Is the United Kingdom started to decline, or?
Well, the United Kingdom is definitely in decline, but if you're asking about the national identity or the origin of these people, you're absolutely right. There is I mean, it's an incredible, and indeed there was a time when, it's just changed recently, but when I think there was only, of the four most powerful ministries, so finance, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, at least three, if not all four, were people of colour. It's just changed, incidentally, but we had, for example, as Home Secretary until recently, there was a woman whose parents were from East Africa, Indian woman from East Africa. So, yes, the ethnic makeup of Britain has undeniably changed. Certainly, you can see it in London, and also in fact, all the big cities of the United Kingdom. All the big cities of the United Kingdom are now the white British population, and I use the term white British quite specifically because it is an official category. Whenever there is a census in Britain, the people are invited to state their ethnic group, the ethnic group that they belong to or identify as. And white British is one of the categories. And white British have been in a minority in London for at least 20 years. And now that is also true of the other big cities, Birmingham, Manchester, and so on. So ethnically, the country has undeniably changed and is continuing to change. I mentioned immigration a moment ago in respect of Brexit. In 2022, the total number of immigrants arriving in Britain was 1 million. And it has been hundreds of thousands, 500,000, 600,000 for the last 20 years. There's been absolutely gigantic levels of immigration, far higher than, for example, in France, where I live, even though, of course, France also has a lot of immigrants. So, you know, when you've got 500,000 or 1 million people arriving every year, quite obviously the ethnic makeup of the country is changing radically. I remember it was at least 10 years ago when a school proudly announced that it did not have among its, I think, 400 pupils, a single pupil whose family spoke English at home. That was 10 years ago. And if it was the first such school, then to have 100% of non-English speaking pupils, then you can be sure there were tens, probably hundreds of schools which had 90, 95, 99% of such pupils.
Ukraine is a fiction. Bosnia is a fiction. Kosovo is a fiction. COVID is a fiction. EU is a fiction. All these were created for one reason, to control us. You mentioned that in one of your events. Let's start with Ukraine. Some people says, especially in Hungary or in Romania next to Ukraine, that the attack from Russia has created the Ukrainian identity, and therefore the Russian attack created the Ukrainian nationality and the identity. What's your view about that?
Well, I don't think the Russian attack created Ukrainian national identity. I would say that Ukrainian national identity was created in the 18th century when Galicia was annexed by the then Austrian Empire, so even before Austria-Hungary. Because the Austrians acquired this territory, the territory around Lvov, which of course was populated by what we then called Ruthenians. And I think it's an undisputed fact that Austrian historians from that time in the late 18th and in the 19th century developed the notion of a Ukrainian identity, including by encouraging, although I think that was earlier, the Uniate, so Eastern Orthodox Catholic, the Eastern Rite Catholic Church in that part of the world. But of course, the invasion has intensified Ukrainian national feeling very greatly among those Ukrainians who have that particular version of Ukrainian identity. But it would be quite wrong to say that it has invented it. So I've mentioned the Austrian origins, but during the Soviet period, Ukrainian identity was heavily supported by the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian state only ever came into existence within the Soviet Union. There'd never been a Ukrainian state in the Russian Empire. There was no administrative entity called Ukraine in the Russian Empire, and it was encouraged as part of the rather folkloric idea that the Soviet Union was in fact a union of peoples, which one day would include the whole world. But yeah, of course, the national sentiment of those Ukrainians who think that Ukrainian means not being Russian or being anti-Russian has undeniably been aggravated. But the whole problem about Ukraine, and this is why I said it was a fiction, although of course that remark contains an element of provocation, is that Ukraine is like Ireland, it's like Cyprus, there may be other examples. There are countries where the national identity is divided. So in Ireland, as everybody knows, there are people who are Irish who regard themselves as British and people who are Irish who regard themselves as not British. The Northern Irish, the people in Northern Ireland are Irish. They regard themselves as Irish, but for them, being Irish is compatible with being British. And of course, that's not the Republican tradition. So it's a very similar situation to the one in Ireland, and in Ukraine similarly. All Russians have a Ukrainian grandmother, you know. So for many decades and centuries, Ukrainianness was not incompatible with Russianness. When independence came, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine, like the Baltic states, but unlike Belarus, decided to adopt a distinctly anti-Russian national identity. Leonid Kuchma, one of the earlier presidents, wrote a book saying Ukraine is not Russia. That was how he defined his country. And of course, that category of Ukrainian nationalism has obviously, undeniably been reinforced by the war, of course.
What can be the solution for Ukraine? I mean, one half is like Russian, the other half is like has origins from Poland and things like that, or western part of Ukraine. So what can be the solution? It can be divided between these, or like occupied by Poland and Romania and Hungary and Russia?
Well, I don't think, what you asking me, what could be the solution? I personally don't think there will be a solution. I suppose I could give you a plan and say what I think might possibly happen, but I don't think there will be a solution. I think, on the contrary, it will be what we call a frozen conflict, such as exists, as you know, already in Georgia and in Moldova, and in you know, elsewhere on the territory of the former Soviet Union. So I think undeniably the division of the country into two will continue. Russia, I don't see any scenario in which Russia will be expelled from the territories that she has annexed and occupied. But I don't know also whether the Russians can or want to go further. I don't know whether, for example, they intend to take Odessa as well. That option is surely on the table. They must be thinking about it. Can they do it? I don't know. So I don't really think of the Ukraine war in terms of a solution. I think that a lot of people are talking about stalemate at the moment, which is a way of putting a brave face on what is objectively a defeat from the Western point of view, because, of course, the goals of the West in this war were to liberate Ukrainian territory from Russian occupation, including Crimea, and that obviously is more distant than ever. But I think that the notion of stalemate is misleading also, because whatever happens on the military level, the West won't give up. Nobody will give up. I don't see there being a peace agreement. I think that there will be an open wound, probably for a generation at least.
In this event, you also mentioned that the war in Ukraine is a war between fiction and reality. What is about the war in Israel?
Well, yes, I don't think the war in Israel is about fiction and reality. I think the war in Israel is a war, obviously, over territory and between peoples. It is an ethnic conflict. The genocide has been alleged, and while I don't particularly like the accusation of genocide, as I think it's often abused, I think there is a strong prima facie case for saying that the Israelis, in an ideal world, would indeed like the Palestinians to go away, to go somewhere else. It's been said, after all, more or less, by a number of Israeli leaders, including not so much the Prime Minister, but other ministers and senior figures in the Israeli Defense Force. So I think that it is an ethnic conflict between two peoples who are in a territory that is too small for both of them. And as with Ukraine, I personally don't see any way out. This problem has been going on now since at least the 1920s. Since the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917, very quickly when Jews started to go to then British Palestine, there was violence. And the two-state solution that everybody talks about is in fact nothing but the partition plan that the British drew up in 1936, and which, as a matter of fact, only inflamed tensions even more. The Israelis ended up accepting it in 1947-48, when the State of Israel was created. But ultimately, it didn't work in 1936. It hasn't worked since 1948. And I'm very pessimistic about the future of Israel. I think that, unfortunately, it's not a battle between fiction and reality. It's a battle between two very real things, namely two peoples who would like to control the whole of the territory between the river and the sea.
What I can see is that in the Western world, they say that Ukraine has a right to defend itself, but Israel maybe not have a right to defend itself. Why do you think the Western world is so rough against Israel?
Well, I don't see that at all. The West, surely politically, is very supportive of Israel. I'm surprised that you say that the West is critical. Because it's not the West that's critical. The European Union, the United States, they may be changing their tune a little now, but in the first weeks that followed the October the 7th attacks, they gave unconditional support to Israel to the extent of refusing, for example, to call for a ceasefire. So in other words, they said, yes, the Israelis are right to have a military response to these attacks. So I don't see that. I see on the contrary, and as we saw with the application before the International Court of Justice, Canada, Germany, Britain, the United States have all said that they support Israel in that application. But so to me, it's the global South that is, South Africa, obviously, the BRICS countries, China to some extent, Russia is relatively neutral, but it's mainly, and of course, the Arab world. That is the part of the world that's against Israel, not the West, not the collective West.
But we can see that the West criticize Israel because of the bombing in Gaza.
Well, I would say they criticize it far less than other countries. I don't see the West being particularly critical. I mean, it depends. There are some exceptions. Belgium, for example, has a foreign minister who's quite hostile to Israel. But otherwise, on the European level, there is. I mean, when Ursula von der Leyen went to Jerusalem, she didn't say a word about international law. She was there on the 13th of October, and she gave unconditional support. And indeed, she continues to give unconditional support. She, by the way, has no right to speak on foreign policy, but she does a lot.
Go back to the origin quote. You said that like these fictions were created to control us. Who is in control? I mean, we saw that many political and economic leaders were gathered in Davos. Could they be the controller ones, or who?
Well, in the speech that I gave where I said Ukraine is a fiction, Bosnia is a fiction, Kosovo is a fiction, I was referring to control by the Americans, by NATO and by the Americans. Those countries are fictions. It's very clear in the case of Bosnia. It's clear in the case of Kosovo. I didn't necessarily have time. I can't remember if I had time to explain myself at length in that speech. But there's no such nation as Kosovo. The majority population in Kosovo is Albanian. It's not Kosovar. It's Albanian. They speak Albanian. They identify as Albanians. They are Albanians. So Kosovo is a fiction because the reality is Greater Albania, or at least the de facto creation of a Greater Albania. Bosnia, similarly, there is no Bosnian nation. There are, on the contrary, 3 nations that live in Bosnia, all of whom regard Bosnia as their home. There wouldn't have been a civil war otherwise. And Ukraine is, in that sense, a little bit similar to, it's not, of course, exactly the same as Bosnia, but as I said a moment ago, there is, as we now know, and has been even before the war, because the electoral map of Ukraine in repeated presidential elections shows it, there is a divide in Ukraine between the national identity of Ukraine. So you have the southeast that's pro-Russian and the northwest that is anti-Russian. But who controls, you mentioned Davos and so on. I don't think it's a secret to anyone that Davos, the whole point about Davos is to bring together big business and governments within an overall managerial ethic. The origins of the World Economic Forum lie in management. Klaus Schwab was a professor of management at Geneva University or Geneva Business School or something. And when he created the forum in 1973, it had a different name. It was called the European Management Forum. It wasn't called the World Economic Forum. So it brings together big business and government with the specific ideological goal of blending the two, of making governments more like companies and of making companies more like governments. That's one of the explicit goals. And who controls it? Well, it's a bit of a pleonasm to say, but the elites, in other words, rich people and powerful people. So this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's, in fact, it's almost a self-evident truth that powerful people who have money or power, who control countries, for example, that when they get together, they naturally like to make plans for how to remain in power and how to, realize their vision of the world. And that's what Davos embodies. It embodies, I mentioned in respect of Europe, I mentioned a cartel. I think the notion of a cartel is also useful at the international level as well as at the European level.
What is the difference between Davos and the Bilderberg Group?
The Bilderberg Group was set up with a much more explicitly transatlantic agenda. I think Davos, we've certainly seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine that Davos also now has taken its side because Russia was disinvited from the World Economic Forum, and as far as I know, didn't participate this year or last year. But initially, Davos did not have an explicitly transatlantic agenda. The Bilderberg Group was set up in 1953 by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, specifically to encourage Atlanticist feeling, Atlanticist thinking among European elites. That was the purpose of it, and that's what it does. The World Economic Forum, as I say, has a more if it has an ideology, it is this managerism. It's this idea that the world should be governed at the global level according to plans, some of which are elaborated by the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum signed a few years ago a strategic partnership with the United Nations to realize to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are nothing other than a plan for world government. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is it's just fact. The way those goals are formulated, the text of those goals, things like ending poverty or whatever, they are so open-ended as goals that they can only be implemented, and that's their goal, that is their function, by a world government. That's why they are promoted by the United Nations and by the World Economic Forum. So that's the ideology, if you like, of the World Economic Forum. It's managerism at a global level.
And maybe we can call it neo-Marxism, this whole thing. What is the basic theory of neo-Marxism? How can we describe it? What are the basics?
Well, one of the key Marxist-Leninist beliefs or doctrines was the withering away of the state. Engels wrote about this. Lenin, of course, wrote about it. Lenin wrote in 1917 in The State and Revolution, "Where there is the state, there is no freedom. When there will be no state, where there is the state, there is no freedom. When there is no state, there will be freedom," or something like, I've forgotten now the exact quote. But anyway, he makes it very clear in a couple of words that the state is the enemy and the state is an instrument of oppression. This is core Marxist theory. According to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the state is an instrument of oppression of the working class by the bourgeoisie. Marx has this the famous line that the spinning wheel gives you the feudal society, and the steam engine gives you modern capitalism. All right. So Marxism argues that the state is a superstructure that flows from economic balance of power. So, but if you have classes which are in antagonism as they are and as they were for the Marxist point of view, then the state is a creation, an instrument to maintain the domination of the bourgeoisie over the working class. And of course, when the working class takes power and there is no class left to be oppressed by definition, then the state will wither away. That's the Marxist dogma. And that dogma has, of course, this is perhaps what you're suggesting in your question, has not only survived the so-called collapse of communism, but has, on the contrary, prospered in the decades that have followed the end of the Cold War, if it's even right to talk about the end of the Cold War, because we are back, I think, in a Cold War. But anyway, in the last 3 decades. And that's, of course, what gives us globalism. The state is, both at the European level and at the international level, is regarded as an instrument of oppression. States are regarded as bad. They are regarded as incompatible with the world economy, as antiquated. All the Marxist vocabulary. Again, Marx said that the state would be relegated to a museum of antiquities, like the rack and other instruments of torture and things like that. So that has that theory, that old Marxist dogma has returned in force. It never really went away. And it's one of the core Marxist dogmas, and it, as I say, is the core as well of modern globalization.
Ronald Reagan also mentioned that the state is not the solution, it's the problem itself. Ronald Reagan is a communist as well, or Marxist, or...
No. It's a problem of language, which he and Margaret Thatcher also made the same mistake. What they meant, of course, was that the modern bureaucratic state is too interventionist in the economy and so on. Neither Ronald Reagan nor Margaret Thatcher wanted to get rid of their own countries. On the contrary, they were both patriots and wanted to strengthen their countries. They wanted the state to do its function properly of protecting its citizens, upholding the law, encouraging prosperity, and all the rest of it. They didn't want the state to try to administer bureaucratically the daily lives of ordinary people. So it was a problem of language, but it was a very serious mistake of language to make. In the case of Mrs. Thatcher, she talked about rolling back the frontiers of the state, which of course was what she did in the sense in which she meant it. At least she partly did it. But Jacques Delors came along. Jacques Delors, the then president of the European Commission, recently died. And he said, yes, you want to roll back the frontiers of your state? I will certainly help you do that. But of course, he had a different understanding of the word state. He meant the state as such, and she just meant the bureaucratic administration.
The second part of our our interview is about world order. We can see that the Western civilization is in decline. What is the reason for Europe's and Western's decline?
Well, I think that it is as far as Europe is concerned, I think the two world wars finished Europe as a world actor. As we all know, power left Europe and went to America and for a while to Russia, which, while of course a European power is a peripheral European power, a bit like Britain. But you're right that it's not just Europe anymore that's in decline, it's the West. The Americans are undoubtedly in decline. I think the American decline is a little different. It's, to me, very similar to the Roman Empire. The American state, as President Eisenhower warned in his famous valedictory speech in, was it 1963, has been captured, 1962, been captured by the military-industrial complex, to use his words. It's one of the most important things that Julian Assange said. There's a good video that circulates on YouTube of him many, many years ago, 15 years ago, I think, where he says the goal in Afghanistan, because the Americans are, of course, still in Afghanistan when he made this, is not to win the war, it is to prolong the war as long as possible, because the Afghan war, he says, and this applies to all the other wars, is simply a way of recycling American taxpayers' money into the arms manufacturers. It's business. Antony Blinken said this, the Secretary of State. He said it at Davos, as a matter of fact, and he said it on other occasions, but only a week or so ago in Davos, he said that of all the money that the American state has given to Ukraine, in fact, I think he said 60%, or was it 90%, I can't remember the percentage, but a majority of that money has not actually physically gone to Ukraine. It's instead, of course, gone to buy weapons or to pay weapons manufacturers in America to make weapons to send to Ukraine. And that has now reached such colossal proportions. The budget, the military budget of the United States is now $800 or $850 billion a year. That's well over $2 billion a day. These are colossal sums of money, even for a big country like America. And quite simply, the military industrial complex, which is gigantic in America, has taken the Republic hostage. And that's one of the reasons why the Americans respond to every single international issue militarily. They don't do diplomacy anymore, the Americans. I don't know whether they ever did, but they respond to everything militarily, and with less and less success. Today's the 28th of January. 2 or 3 days ago, the American Navy was escorting 2 big merchant ships through the Gulf of Aden, through the Red Sea. They were fired on by the now famous Houthis in Yemen, and they turned round. The ships turned round and left. America was defeated in a brief battle, a brief naval battle. The American ships, the merchant ships turned round, and the American Navy ship that was supposedly protecting them followed. This is incredible. This is an incredible. It's of course a very symbolic moment. You know, the Americans thought they could defeat the Houthis by throwing a few bombs at them, and instead it is they who have been defeated. And the reason, of course, or I say of course, the reason is that the whole military thing is more and more about money and less about actually winning wars. It's one of the reasons why I said that the Ukraine war was a fight between reality and fiction, because my conviction when I gave that speech, and it remains the case today, is that Russia will win this war militarily, at least in the sense that it will not be expelled from Ukraine. And if it does win it, and if it's not expelled from Ukraine, that is objectively a defeat for NATO.
In one of your speech, you mentioned Brzezinski's book, and you highlighted that he wrote that the end of unipolar world order will be when China, Russia, and Iran would make a coalition against the US.
Absolutely.
Based on not ideology, but on the will to change the world.
Absolutely.
And that's mentioned, Kissinger also mentioned that in the book called Diplomacy. Why did the US or the leaders of the US refuse to believe that?
Well, I suppose that they... well, I mean, I'm not sure that they refuse. It's difficult to say that they refuse to believe it. I mean, of course, it's difficult for a world superpower to accept that its end is near and that it won't be able to call the shots for much longer. But let's not forget that Argentina announced that it would not be joining BRICS when Milei was elected. Now, was that a result of American pressure, or maybe Milei himself was always against joining BRICS? I don't know. But I think the Americans probably regard the enlargement of BRICS with more than caution, with hostility. So I'm not sure that they... I suppose if they don't believe... in other words, I think some of them are probably aware that things are shifting. But of course it is, as I say, it's difficult to accept that, your days as a world superpower are over. But the fact is that, as Brzezinski explains very clearly, America can control Eurasia only with some difficulty, because obviously physically it's not in Eurasia, so it's a long way away, or at least relatively a long way away. And it can only do it by establishing points of influence on the Eurasian continent and having alliances here and there to prevent the Eurasian countries joining up. Well, many of those alliances have now disappeared. Above all, Saudi Arabia, which is perhaps the most extraordinary diplomatic event, really, of recent times. The way in which Riyadh seems to have reoriented its foreign policy away from America and towards Russia. We saw how Putin was received. We saw how Biden was received in Riyadh when he asked the Saudis to increase oil production. They told him he left empty-handed, and instead they now have a deepening alliance with Russia, both through OPEC, but also in other areas. And of course, we all know about the Russian-Chinese alliance, which is deeper, which gets deeper and deeper as time goes on.
I'm happy that you mentioned BRICS, because 12 years ago, in an article, you mentioned that Russia improved its international position through organizations like BRICS or the Shanghai Operation Organization. How can BRICS form the world? Or how can BRICS change the world?
Well, I think the most important element is the Russian-Chinese alliance. The other things like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are just an emanation of this basic diplomatic fact. It's an alliance which I think will prosper because, as with other diplomatic alliances, the two countries are complementary to each other. So China obviously has a gigantic economy, no doubt the biggest economy in the world, or very soon to be the biggest economy in the world. And Russia has a very effective and gigantic military. So the two countries are complementary in that sense. BRICS and the other organizations can change the world in the sense that, well, in terms of population, obviously the BRICS countries are much more populous than the G7. The economic balance of power is also shifting, as I say, particularly, of course, with China. So those countries, I think will indeed, as Brzezinski says, will grow closer together in opposition to what, by any standards, is becoming an increasingly desperate attempt by the collective West to maintain its hegemony.
The supporters of unipolar world order or the US hegemony says that, okay, the US has problems, but this world at least have rules. Which world order is better, if we can say that, the Russian or Chinese one, or the one we have now, the American world order?
Well, I completely reject this slogan of a rules-based international system, which the West claims to embody. That's the slogan in Ukraine and so on. It's one of NATO's big slogans. It's completely untrue. The NATO countries, the collective West, does not play by the rules. We've seen it. You asked me about Israel a moment ago. The collective West supports Israel, and maybe the support now with the International Court of Justice ruling will evolve and weaken. But obviously, you've mentioned Kosovo. Kosovo is, from every point of view, both the 1999 war and the 2008 Declaration of Independence, which the West supported, those are flagrant breaches of the rules-based international system. But in a way, your question is, if I may say so, is not quite the right question. I don't want to live in a Russian world order or in a Chinese world order. What the Russians and the Chinese and the other countries say they want is a multipolar system. In other words, a system in which precisely there isn't one source of order, but there are, let's hope, a more dispersed, there are centers of power. That's what we mean by a multipolar world order. So, of course, I hope that that's what will emerge.
So the last part of our interview will about threats. So what do you think, which are the three largest threats for Europe?
Demography, the declining birth rate. You asked me a moment ago about the reasons for European decline, and I said it was the world wars. But of course, the 1960s hedonistic sexual revolution ideology continues to affect Europe and probably the United States of America as well. I think that declining birth rates, coupled, of course, with immigration from very, very poor countries, is absolutely fatal. So I would say that is the birth rate and the reasons behind the birth rate, the reasons behind it. Those are the biggest threats, I would say. So, in other words, why is it that people are not having children? Why do they not want to have children? There's a very well-known French sociologist, philosopher called Emmanuel Todd, who famously predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union by looking at the birth rate. And of course, the birth rate was very bad in Soviet times. And he said, well, there's something wrong here. A country that doesn't produce children, there must be something wrong with the mentality of the country. And he was right. And I think the same thing applies to Europe today. I think it is one of the many signs of our social collapse. And until we attack the problem at its root, both economically and also philosophically, then I think we are headed for collapse.
In Hungary, loads of experts says that what happens in Europe, the birth rate and the demography, is like the plan of Islam. And Islam want to conquer Europe, like with jihad, third time in the history of the world. Do you think that's true, that the Islam world wants to reconquer Europe?
Well, I'm sure some Muslims do, yes. I think that's entirely natural in a way, given that Islam is a universal religion like Christianity. Unfortunately, as I say, yes, Muslims have a higher birth rate, generally speaking. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why there's a majority Albanian population in Kosovo, because after the Second World War, there was a majority Serbian population there. But yes, I'm sure they do have that desire. But as I say, if Europeans had the sense of purpose and the sense of inner conviction of in their own future and in their own values and what they represent, and if they had that sense enough to make children and to want to, populate their own countries, then of course the Muslims wouldn't be able to do it.
How can we prevent the decline of Europe, the decline of our grandchildren?
It's very difficult to turn around these tendencies. I live in France, which after the First World War, and maybe even before, but certainly after the First World War, where of course France lost, I believe, nearly 2 million people, natalist policies were put in place, and they've remained in place until quite recently, and they were relatively effective. So that's one way. When I say natalist policies, I mean tax breaks for large families, creches where you can put children into daycare and so on, sort of basic practical stuff like that. But ultimately, it's of course about human behavior and about very intimate human behavior, the most intimate form of human behavior. And it's quite difficult to turn that around. I don't really have an easy solution. I observe in France that, although of course France is like many other countries, I know that the number of births in Hungary is apparently the lowest it's ever been last year, I believe. I've heard that said.
I'm not sure, because we have like a great like in 10,000 in 10 we have one of the lowest, but when the Fidesz came and made some policies, it became better and better, and we have a worse like 10 years ago, so it's not that bad.
Okay, well, maybe it's a wrong piece of information, but what I wanted to say is that in France, in 2023, it was the lowest number of births, I think, forever. 700,000 births was the lowest figure ever. So France is following the European trend, but there is a tradition in France, including quite recently, of big families. There is a tradition of people getting married quite young. Again, I'm not saying that France has bucked the trend, it hasn't, but you do see in France young people, young couples, young families, particularly of course in Catholic circles, but it is a phenomenon. It's a minority phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon which, as far as I know, you don't see anywhere else in Europe. So I suppose one way to start would be by, if one wanted to have a really natalist policy, would be, I don't know, showing the example and encouraging young people, particularly, of course, young men. It's also a matter of, surely it's also a matter of education. Young men, certainly in Britain, they wouldn't dream, or very few would even think of having children when they're in their 20s. So, there needs to be, in other areas, we talk about the nudge. There's nudge theory, you try to encourage people's behavior. Well, perhaps it would be good to use some of that nudge theory in demographics as well. Luckily,
I have friends like, I'm 20 years old, I'm married, and I have friends who's like at the age of mine, and we can see this phenomenon in Hungary as well, luckily. So like we are started to awake, luckily.
Yeah.
Christianity is the base of our civilization,
yes.
The base of European and Western civilization. What are the biggest threats for Christianity?
Well, it's a bit like, I suppose I should have answered one of your earlier questions by mentioning Christianity, so I'm glad that you've raised it. It's a bit like with demography. The threat comes from inside. It doesn't come from outside. It doesn't come from the Muslims. the threat to Christianity comes from the Christian churches themselves. The Catholic Church is in an absolutely catastrophic situation with the, of course, the current Pope, but ultimately the fact that so many bishops, there are, I don't know, what, 4,000 or 5,000 Catholic bishops in the world, so few of them have, well, I believe in Africa it's a bit different, but certainly in Europe, very, very few bishops have reacted against his latest outrages. So the church, unfortunately itself, the Catholic Church, I don't know about Protestant churches, but the Catholic Church has itself causing its own collapse. And of course, because that's an internal problem, that's also a bit like with demography. It's also a problem that can only be resolved internally. There have to be, we have to pray that bishops and others will basically start to be Catholic again, which they seem to have stopped doing for the time being.
Luckily, Hungarian bishops are more likely to criticize this new pope and things like that.
Have they done so?
Yes, because of the last, I don't know, speech was, or I don't know what he did, but about this LGBTQ stuff, the Hungarians were criticizing it. Good. And you mentioned the Protestants, they aren't doing that good. I mean, the Westerns are like in Switzerland or in France or in England, they like they don't have any problems with the LGBTQ community, and that's a huge problem. But in the eastern part of Europe, like for Hungary, in Hungary or in Poland, in Romania, we stand still, luckily.
Good.
What can be the solution? I asked it before, but can be the solution that normal peoples, like conservative peoples, move together in one country in order to defend our values?
Well, that in a way would be a shame, because it would mean, of course, them leaving their own countries. If, for instance, they were all to come here, then, which of course I believe some people do. No, the ideal solution would be to go with nature and to leave people where they are and to encourage them to live normal lives where they are. But of course, I recognize that, we're a long way from that. And in fact, we're traveling in the opposite direction at the moment.
We hope that Europe will awake from this nightmare. Our time is up.
Thank you.
Dr. John Laughland, thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thanks.
I've enjoyed our conversation.